Good day, class. My name is Lance Wade. My research study focused on man-made disasters in the Arctic and the challenges facing crisis communications. This research presentation will cover the following 7 points. I'll begin with the introduction, the changing Arctic environment, followed by my research question and objective, a brief overview of qualitative comparative case study analysis, data collection methods, I'll review the findings, followed by recommendations and conclusions. The global climate is constantly evolving, and in recent recorded history, the Arctic temperatures are increasing at an unprecedented rate. A study by Kaufman in 2009 supports previous research findings that the Arctic has been undergoing a slow summer cooling effect. These warming temperatures, compounded with snow and ice melt, have produced an opportunity for economic growth in the Canadian Arctic region. For the first time, the Northwest Passage, or NWP, is free of ice and snow, allowing for transatlantic commercial vessels to travel through these waters. A report conducted by the Government of Canada in 2008 found that a voyage through the Northwest Passage could cut approximately 7,100 kilometers off the traditional shipping routes between certain ports in Europe and Asia. These factors raise concerns for the potential of a catastrophic man-made disaster in the polar regions. Are crisis communicators prepared to manage a man-made disaster in the Arctic? This research asked, how can Canadian Armed Forces public affairs officers better equip and manage man-made disasters affecting the Arctic region? The objective, by examining and comparing lessons learned from previous crisis communication case studies, the research provided a communications best practices strategy that can be applied to the unique nature of and the challenges facing public affairs officers operating in the Arctic. The purpose of this research will compare 2 man-made disaster case studies using content analysis. The Exxon Valdez disaster occurred in late March of 1989 when an Exxon oil tanker struck a reef, causing a hull rupture that spilled 10 million gallons of oil in Alaska's Prince William Sound. The oil covered 1,300 miles of coastline and 11,000 square miles of ocean. The disaster had a catastrophic impact on the environment, marine mammals, tourism, and the local economy. In the case study by David Williams and Glenda Treadaway, they identified Exxon's crisis communications failures. They were a number of contributing crisis communication failures which led the oil conglomerate fighting multiple internal and external battles to repair their corporate image. In summary, the organization's failure and inability to react during the initial moments following the disaster and their ill-fated attempts to place blame on employees and other scapegoating tactics. In addition to the Exxon oil spill, there were many parallels drawn from a similar man-made disaster case study. The BP oil spill occurred in April 2010, when an explosion aboard the oil refinery in the Gulf of Mexico killed 11 people and leaked 780 million gallons of crude oil into the sea. This became known as the worst man-made disaster in history. The disaster marked a watershed moment for the oil industry, and in particular for the importance of a solid crisis communication strategy framework. The case study by Daniel DeWolf and Mohammed Mehri revealed BP failed to influence public opinion. Instead, false information and accusations against partners blurred the truth about the deadly environmental disaster. Why I chose these case studies was because it offered insight into communications failures of 2 of the world's worst man-made disasters and how it underpins the importance of a sound crisis communication strategy, particularly how a crisis could deteriorate a government entity such as the Canadian Armed Forces. The data collection process utilized Timothy Coombs' evidence-based situational crisis communications theory. The theory provides an understanding how to maximize an organizational reputational protection following a crisis disaster. The 3 clusters of crisis include victim, accidental, and preventable cluster. I will focus on the preventable cluster as both case study disasters could have been avoided had the organization taken the proper safety precautions. Preventable crisis is the hardest for organizations to control. Situational crisis communication theory urges that once a strategy has been selected, that one response option should be adhered to and not mixed. This is indicated in phase 2 of table 1. While collecting the qualitative data, 4 observations were constructed by identifying each communications failure. They include, number 1, identification of repeated terminology or themes. Number 2, was SCCT framework used? Which cluster and response strategy and why? Number 3, were the best practice strategies followed? Why not? And number 4, the negative impacts of those communication failures. The key observations were placed within the sample sheet, and several findings were extracted to help illustrate patterns for best practices and to support my analysis. Moving forward, I applied these lessons learned tailored to the unique challenges facing communication strategies in the North. The findings of these lessons learned allowed for a thorough evaluation of critical failures associated with Exxon's and BP's handling of the crisis. The findings also revealed 2 critical goals which Exxon failed to execute utilizing the SCCT framework. Firstly, Exxon needed to establish a communication strategy that aligned with providing the media and the public their initial response to the disaster and what it was going to do to prevent further damage. The second was to restore faith in the public and shareholders. It was apparent BP's legitimacy, trustworthiness, truthfulness, and honesty were imperceptible. The aforementioned best practices checklist identified BP's post-crisis communication failures. BP's consistent use of the SCCT model, in particular the deny response strategy, managed to steer responsibility towards other partners. It is without question BP's negligence using Covello's and Bernstein's best practices failed to influence public opinion. Instead, false information and accusations against partners blurred the truth about the deadly environmental disaster. The linear graph acts as a visual aid for comparing the 2 disasters, extrapolating the commonalities, and applying the best practices to Arctic crisis communication strategy. This is identified in column 5. Designate the lead organization, respond in the golden hour, clear concise messaging, operate in joint operations, maintain open and frequent communications with whole of government partners. If at fault, take ownership, be empathetic to the local indigenous needs and concerns. If there are fatalities, ensure families are notified first prior to release of private information. Embrace media and social. Understand the scope and time needed for each phase of the disaster. Maintain a media log. Keep partners and media apprised of recovery efforts and understanding the limitations and be flexible. I recommend public affairs officers adopt the SCCT deal response strategy. This strategy has proved that the CAF can preserve its moral and ethical integrity by responding openly to the needs of Canadians while maintaining faith with stakeholders. What was discovered? Social media will have a dramatic influence on how information is disseminated. Graphic content could cripple the crisis communications effort. The response from the communications team will be a determining factor on how the situation is handled. And social media holding lines will need to be pre-planned and updated as the crisis unfolds. Some other recommendations I have for the Government of Canada in the austere Arctic environment is to establish a disaster training facility, invest in communications infrastructure such as cell towers and high-speed internet, as well as enhanced navigational and aerial observing systems or early warning systems. In conclusion, the situational crisis communications theory proved to hold as a strong and applicable model for analyzing data utilizing a qualitative comparative case study method. SCCT combined with Covello and Bernstein's best practices checklist effectively shows the relationship between the organization's responsibility, the response necessary to deal with the crisis, and the moral obligations the organization has to the public and its stakeholders. I believe this research is important as it could potentially mitigate misconceptions, falsehoods, and provide communication experts the knowledge base they need to manage expectations during a crisis in the Arctic. The findings provide a solid crisis communication strategy for which public affairs officers can build upon while managing a crisis in the Arctic. It is not a matter of if a crisis will happen, it is when.